Review.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cryptid Creator Corner podcast. I'm Byron O'Neill, your host for today's chat, coming to you from the North Carolina Piedmont, where temperatures are finally starting to resemble the actual season. We had quite the warm spell there. I'm delighted because I get to talk with a fellow native Tennessean who also happens to be an Eisner, Ringo, International Horror Guild, and National Cartoonist Society winner, Eric Powell. As a huge fan of Hillbilly, one of my all-time favorite comics. I've wanted to have Eric on the show for quite some time. We'll be focusing on his new, unique Victorian-inspired ghost story anthology. That's a mouthful. Project coming out this holiday season from Dark Horse Comics on his Albatross imprint. Foregathered on Christmas Eve. Eric, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, when I first saw the concept, I immediately went to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in my head, or kind of rather the origin of her writing it anyway, with a few friends who got together in Geneva in the 1816, who came up competition to see who could write the best horror story. The rest there is history. So what made you want to kind of tackle a comics anthology full of Victorian era ghost stories?
Yeah. Well, I always loved the idea that it used to be a tradition to sit around and tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve. And I was kind of bummed out that that didn't exist anymore. There's that movie, I think from like 1981, Ghost Story, based
Okay, yeah.
on a Peter Straub book.
Mhm.
And there's a society of these old men called the Chowder Society, and they sit around and tell each other's ghost stories. I was rewatching the movie, and I started thinking to myself how I started being really envious of these guys because they had that little group that they got around and had a few drinks and sat by a fire and told ghost stories.
Sure.
That's the only thing I'm envious of them about from that story. But um, yeah, and that was really the where the idea came from.
Okay.
Um, and I thought for I had been thinking for a while of doing something a Victorian ghost story collection or something. Um, uh, but instead of doing it all by myself, I thought I should get other creators in, and then it would kind of really have that vibe of people gathering to tell ghost stories. And then I took it a step further and actually created kind of avatars for us
Right. Yeah.
that are Victorian versions of ourselves, actually sitting around a fire and on Christmas Eve and telling ghost stories.
So, as a student of mythology myself, I mean, I literally have a degree in it. I love digging into the background of this tradition, telling these types of stories during the holidays. The tradition was really fascinating. Originated with kind of that oral history route, with the
Mhm.
Industrial Revolution making books cheaper, more accessible to everybody. So it became this really interesting mechanism to look at class dynamics through that kind
Mhm.
of lens of a horror story while keeping a rural tradition alive. So did you always intend to kind of maintain something more traditional? Because it's like really in fashion now for steampunk to be associated
Yeah.
with anything Victorian, right? And I guess
Yeah.
there's a bit of a flavor of that, maybe without giving too much away in one of the
Yeah.
stories anyway. But yeah.
Yeah. The story that James Heron illustrates, I wanted the stories to have different vibes, and luckily with the creators that uh, joined me on this book, that wasn't a problem because everyone brings their own, you know, flavor to the thing. Um, with James's, I was just thinking about his art. I actually wrote his story. Uh, uh, it was his art that kind of inspired it, and I thought that uh, also astronomy at the time, at the
Mhm.
Victorian age, and they actually thought that there was a another planet, I guess around Mercury called Vulcan,
Mhm.
which was a thing for a while because Mercury had a weird orbit. And I thought that would be fun to kind of like incorporate into this because it doesn't seem, it'd be kind of a twist.
Right.
Um, so a ghost ship in space was kind of a Victorian ghost ship in space where that went.
Well, you kind of mentioned you've enlisted some really big heavy hitters who are contributing to the project. So how did you convince Mike and Becky and James to kind of jump on board with this?
Well, I did the smart thing and I convinced Mike first.
Okay,
So,
yeah, that makes sense.
and it didn't take much convincing because, I said, "Hey, I'm going to do a book of Victorian ghost stories." And he's like, "Okay," because I mean, that's right up his alley.
Right.
And then, I just went to Becky and James and said, "I'm doing this book with Mike. Do you want in?" And they, you know, I think Mike was the draw. I'll be a little humble, but obviously, I think Mike was the draw. There.
He's always an easy draw for
Yeah,
anything, right? You
yeah,
put his name on it, and people are going to at least pay attention. So,
mhm,
I mean, and you mentioned there's a kind of a twist that I haven't seen for a comics anthology, and that you've kind of you put the creators in the story as a part of the story, and they kind of there's a their own kind of weaving narrative. I mean, I've seen it before where it's like a comic book shop and you have the people and then you cut to an anthology, but this I felt was a standalone story.
mhm,
So when you did you enlist the creators and then like, okay, now I'm going to infuse this element, or you kind of mentioned that you always wanted to have the sort of avatar thing.
yeah.
um so
Yeah, I kind of pitched the idea to the other creators and then wrote a script and sent it to them, and they were like, "Great." And I showed, them character sketches. Um and kind of warned them that I was making us all terrible people.
okay.
and, and drawing us a little crazy, which I had to make sure that I drew myself kind of the most unflattering of the group, so there wouldn't be any. I didn't want there to be any hard feelings, like if they looked at it and was like, "Why did you draw me like that?" So I drew myself the most unflattering. But yeah, I wanted it to. I didn't want it to be like. I love the horror host concept, Uncle Creepy and Cousin Eerie, and
Yeah,
everything like
crypt
that.
keeper, all that.
But I didn't want this to feel that way. I did want it to feel like part of the story. And as Becky described it, these are like our D&D characters.
Okay, that makes
you
sense.
know, and so I did want it to, uh, be its own thing. And kind of stand alone as just another story in the book.
Okay, well, saying Becky kind of viewed it through that lens of a D&D character makes so much more sense to me now, because I was going to ask, why is she the only one that gets familiar of sorts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was gonna tell you a story, but I think it would uh
Too
give
much
the
away.
ending, yeah, give the ending away, but
Yeah, no worries.
yeah.
Well, Christmas, kind of centering it around that, and the holidays, in many ways has about as many boogeymen as Halloween does, right?
Mhm.
So we have the Christmas Carol tradition to Krampus. There's kind of no shortage of dope shit to play with. So,
Yeah.
kind of in fact, considering your love of drawing monsters, I'm sort of surprised Krampus didn't show up in there. Maybe that's a spoiler, but um,
No, a funny story about Krampus, and you can find this, I'm sure, online. I think we actually made a Christmas tin. My partner is a chocolatier, and I think we did a goon uh, Christmas tin that she sold one year with chocolate in it. But I had gotten this book called The Devil in Design years and years and years ago. And this was before the Krampus thing was really, happening, before it was in
right.
popular culture.
Yep.
But it's a book of postcards, the old postcards that, I had were all Krampus. Um, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to do a goon story with this character in it. This will be great. And then I could never get the timing right to get it onto my schedule where it would come out at Christmas. So it's my own fault that this didn't happen because of my scheduling problems. But I, I was going to do a Goon uh, Krampus book, but it started becoming too popular. And then I was like, well, I'll just be another guy jumping on the bandwagon now. But I've always been kind of bummed that I had an opportunity to be like the first guy to do it, and it didn't happen. Um, but yeah, I mean, also I don't think this particular book it would fit too well in there just because it's not in that kind of it wasn't part of the Victorian kind of folklore of Christmas, the British
Right.
folklore of Christmas.
For
It's
sure. Germanic.
Bavarian, yeah, Germanic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, before kind of seeing this, I got to admit some ignorance on the whole Victorian Christmas ghost story, telling tradition. I did order the Valancourt Christmas Ghost Stories book because,
Mhm.
apparently it is indeed a thing, and now I
Yeah.
want to read more about it, right? There's a bit of a Penny Dreadful feel to it a
Mhm.
little bit. So was there something specific that kind of inspired your own story, The Gift of Major Courtenay? Am I pronouncing
Yeah,
that correct? Okay.
Courtney.
Yeah.
Um, that story, like as we were saying, the stories all have a definite feel to them, and all the creators brought that in. With my story, um, I wanted it to be, uh, I wanted it to kind of like hit hard on the kind of Victorian ghost story in literature, not like oral tradition.
Hmm.
Um, so I was definitely trying to like channel M.R. James, who's a big uh, Victorian ghost story writer.
Hmm.
So I was trying to do something that was a little bit more traditional to um, that era than
Okay.
maybe the other creators were.
Yeah, I mean, Becky's story, which I absolutely love,
Hmm.
she posted an image, I think, on her socials, sort of close to the beginning of the year, somewhere around there. I screenshotted it and used it for some coloring practice, right? And at
Hmm.
the time, I had no idea where it was from or where it would show up. So I was delighted to finally see it in there. You know, did everyone just run with, sort of their own concept, and then
Yeah,
come back?
I told them to do whatever they wanted, and this is what happened. And Becky's is really interesting because she made kind of a poem out of it,
Hmm.
which is really great. And with Mike's story, I mean, it's pure Mignola.
Right. Yep.
A lot of atmosphere and everything.
Yeah. But with all the stories, I really enjoyed kind of the main narrative staying pretty much monochrome. I mean, it had like a sepia washing to it,
Hmm.
and it's really a visual space that I could stay in for a long time. It's got a really nice pocket. How did you kind of piece it all together from everyone from a visual standpoint? Because they're all very unique takes, and I've always found it fascinating with the anthology formatting. You know, not to make those transitions jarring.
Hmm.
It's a bit of a challenge. So
Well, my initial concept, and this is what I kind of pitched to everyone, is I wanted the book to be in black and white.
okay.
Um, so my story's still in black and white, but all the other ones are in color. And we made the linking segments. I did a sepia tone wash on it to set it apart. Um, uh, but when Mike was finished with his story, he asked me if I minded if he got it colored because he felt it just would come to visually come together better that way.
Hmm.
And at first I was a little disappointed, but I was like, you know what, if that's the way that it'll look better, then yeah. Um, so he got Dave Stewart to color it, and then so I told Becky and James, I said, Mike's story is going to be in color, so if you want yours in color, you know, you can do black and white or color because mine's still going to be in black and white. And they both chose color. So but I think it works really well. It doesn't I don't think it's distracting. I feel like it does have a good flow. I think the little bit of sepia in the linking segments, makes it a little less jarring when you go to a full color image.
Hmm. Yep, I can understand that.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So and Dave colored all of the other stories.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
was great, you know.
Yeah. I mean, at least you have somebody stylistically. I mean, well, for Mike's story,
Mhm.
I mean, it would read like a Hellboy, right? Like
Yeah.
in terms of the color and everything you would come to expect, I guess.
Mhm.
So it felt very on pocket there. So with your own work, do you work like on watercolor paper? Is that how you start? Because there's a grain to it that feels very
Yeah.
watercolor paper to me. So
Yes. Actually, I switched over to watercolor paper on this project, and I had a bit of a before I had done that, I had a little bit of a disaster. Um, I had a batch of paper, and I had already my process is I pencil everything digitally now
okay,
because it's so much faster and allows you for correction. So then I'll print a blue line on a piece of Bristol and ink it and
okay,
do my washes and everything. So I had penciled everything and printed out all of my blue lines and went through and inked and I with the intention of like, okay, I'm going to go through this story and ink everything, and I'm going to come back and do really because that has a very specific style in mind that I wanted to do. Uh, and thought, I'm going to go straight through and ink it the way in this kind of like very scratchy style, and then I'll come through and do really detailed washes. This is for the linking segment. Well, I got a bad batch of paper. And when I started, I went through and inked everything. And then when I started putting down the washes, it just turned to mud.
oh no,
And I've never had a batch of paper do that poorly for me before. Um, so I powered through and did what I could. And then I had to go back and do a lot of patch panels and things like that.
yeah,
Um, I don't feel like the linking segment story, the illustrations are quite as good as my segment story because of that. It
okay.
feels a little rushed. It feels a little, off. I mean, there are good segments in it, but as a whole, I don't feel like it stands up as well. But um, yeah, so that happened. Um, but yeah, after that, I I was not about to use that paper again. So I went to watercolor paper rather than Bristol, and so there's a little bit more texture in the segment story
Okay.
because it was on watercolor paper.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love working with those heavy contoured papers because it's so
Hmm.
tactile, right?
Right.
I'm coming from more of a fine art photographic angle with it, but
Hmm.
nothing to me beats that like contoured rag cotton paper because yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
It took me a while to realize that my artwork looked better on paper that had some tooth to it. I started out like using really slick paper, and then I was experimenting, and buying different types of paper, and just started like laying down some pencil, and was like, this has so much more character than the smooth stuff. So I completely switched to a tooth, more of a grain to it.
Yeah, yeah. Did you? May I ask what paper you ended up using for that? It's just me being curious here.
It's just a uh Strathmore 500
Okay.
watercolor paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that's something you want to explore more now that you've kind of, gotten into it and
Yeah, after using it, I was really kicking myself that I hadn't been using it for a while. I don't know, for some there's there's a thing, I guess, I'm sure I'm not the only one an artist, you get kind of into well, this is what it's done on.
right.
And, usually I'm not that way. I'm experimental and I'm trying different things and everything, but, it was just like, "Oh, no, you work on Bristol, you don't work on watercolor paper." Even though I'm doing a lot of washes. And after I did that story, due to the paper fiasco, I'm kinda kicking myself that I didn't just say, "Why am I not using watercolor paper?"
I'm looking forward to more watercolor work. I really, really
Yeah.
enjoyed it. I gotta say. I mean,
Thanks.
I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and this really popped to me.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
yeah, yeah, I really enjoyed it. Well, this is your first new kind of Albatross imprint book with Dark Horse.
Mhm.
So, was it mainly an issue of timing that kind of led you to do this over, like, focusing on some of your more IP stuff, like The Goon or Hillbilly or?
Yeah, a lot of life happened after the switch over too, so I got kind of a slow start. We moved and everything, and had some family issues going on. Um, so this the Christmas book was actually a project that was going. It was already in the process of happening at Albatross before we made the switch over, so it got canceled. Um, and So I could move it over to Dark Horse,
Okay.
because it didn't make any sense to go through the long process of releasing a book market kind of book and then canceling it and re-releasing it later at Dark Horse. So I said, we'll just cancel it, and this will be a project that we move over. And because it was already in the process of being done, it became our first book.
Okay, it seems like a good spot to take a quick break. Hey, y'all. Jimmy recently scored me a signed, personalized copy of Hallows Eve from Erica Schultz after our interview. You've probably had this problem too. I got this great book. Now, how do I display this thing? Well, I discovered this great product from Crafty Comics that lets you showcase your treasured comics, and they even have options for arty slab books too. I got their Flex Frame, which is amazing as you can customize the backing, and it even has interchangeable border colors to coordinate with your space. I opted for neutral gray to match the blue in my room. You can hang portrait or landscape, and it comes with a template to make it easy to ensure that you get it exactly where you want it. To my surprise, my wife, who tolerates my comic stuff, was actually impressed with the overall quality and look. Win! So if you're looking for the perfect solution to showcase your own collection, visit craftycomics.com online. That's crafty with an I. Use the discount code YETI5 and get 5% off your order. All right, let's get back to the show.
With that switch, I'm imagining in some ways there's kind of a tension release, kind of being back under the umbrella of a major comics publisher, at least in terms of like your creative output potential, right? Because it's a
Yeah.
tough road as a creator, managing all these direct market aspects of publishing.
Yeah, I think I kind of went through a burnout period once we made the agreement with Dark Horse, because I had been going nonstop for 6 years. And that because as a publisher, it was like, well, we have to have something in the catalog every month, or otherwise we're not really active as a publisher.
Right.
So I'm, working on projects all the time, and then running the publishing company.
Yeah.
And we were handling a lot of everything ourselves. So I don't think I realized how burnout I was getting until I actually had a moment to stop and catch my breath. And then it was hard for me to get going again. It was just like, that kind of like stress of sitting down and doing something,
Yeah.
you know. Uh but yeah, I also, on the opposite end of that, I've been kind of stressing out the fact that we haven't had anything out yet because we had this, transition period. And I'm very excited, and Dark Horse had a much longer, or has a much longer lead in time than, as a small publisher, Albatross did.
Hmm.
If I wanted to do a book, I could solicit it and have it on the stands in 3 to 4 months,
Sure. Hmm.
um, with Dark Horse, of course, with their distribution and everything, it's a much lengthier process. So, we've been working on projects, but we haven't had anything coming out. So I'm very excited that this book is coming, and that it's now the start.
Yeah.
This book is going to be out there, then the next book, and then this and that. And so we're actually starting to roll.
Awesome. Well, is the plan to kind of dive back into the characters in like the Albatross Exploding Funny books with Dark Horse? Maybe with the exception of the Death Toilet, but
Yeah. That's what bummed me out, because I had like, um for those listening who don't know, we had an anthology called Albatross Exploding Funny Books, but again, we got one issue out and then decided to move to Dark Horse, so that got scrapped. Um but in it I had like a 1-page kind of trailer for a slasher movie called The Terror Toilet.
Yep.
And I had ideas for like 7 sequels.
Okay.
So I think those will pop up in the Goon or something because I find them funny.
Yeah.
It's literal toilet humor. So
Oh, 100%. I thought it was